myself and appreciate that, in fact, poetically, Whitman is, probably going to do this a little bit better than Ayn Rand, but he is Whitman after all. But notice Rand's beautiful poetry to celebrate the individual. What must I say besides? These are the words. This is the answer. I stand here on the summit of the mountain. I lift my head and I spread my arms. This pose will be an important one, by the way, to get ready to read Fountainhead. At the beginning, we have Howard Rourke standing very much in a similar posture. And at the end of Fountainhead, we have Howard Rourke standing on the top of one of his buildings in the same. That notion of the upright human being standing proud is an important Randian motif. This, my body and spirit, this is the end of the quest. And we realize this has been a story about quests. A mythology, right? A myth of quests. I wish to know the meaning of things. I am the meaning. I wish to find a warrant for being. I need no warrant for being and no word of sanction upon my being. I am the warrant and the sanction. And then on it goes, reading very much like prose poetry. It is my eyes which see, and the sight of my eyes grants beauty to the earth, what we will call perspicacity, insight, right? It is my ears which hear, and the hearing of my ears gives its song to the world. It is my mind which thinks, and the judgment of my mind is the only searchlight that can find the truth. This is what we will call Rand's extreme rationalism. It is my will which chooses, and the choice of my will is the only edict I must respect. Well, on this 11th chapter goes, the tension between the collective, the herd as Nietzsche will call it, and the individual. And here, discovering the pronoun I is liberating then for our narrator. He will then realize this is what he has been banned from saying all his life, and by extension, obviously, appreciating it. Well, there's no question, this discovery is the epiphany of all epiphanies, right? The moment, Joyce will call it an epiphany, the moment that one discovers something from which one can never return after one discovers it. Interestingly, the thing that they first decide to do is to rename themselves so that they can have a name of their own identity. They choose it. He chooses Prometheus. She chooses Gaia. And, of course, we're thinking about Adam and Eve as this selection is made, right? So much of a reworking of the Genesis 3 story, right? Where we're in not Eden, but in a new Eden, in this uncharted forest area. After they decide to rename themselves, they decide to settle in the house, of course, Prometheus now is going to continue his writing, and several things are going to happen. They will have children. He will learn that individual happiness is the only reason that he needs for living, and that the human ego is the most sacred thing in the universe. Of course, freedom then is the precious gift that a human being can possess. This is huge for Rand, and of course it's huge in Anthem as well. Gaia is enjoying her life. She enjoys looking in the mirror, as we said, and we think of Eve in Paradise Lost, who will find her way to the pond and will look in and see herself before she's called by the angel. Look at our lectures on LearnStrong.net for Milton's Paradise Lost if you're interested in that. The novel will end with revelations. Gaia is going to have a child, which will mean that they can start a family. Our narrator, Prometheus, is going to return to society one day. We know the Promethean myth to know how important this idea is. And he's going to fight to try and bring back the freedom that has been lost for those who long for that freedom. His banner, we are told in the very final lines of the novel, so that everyone will recognize it, will have the sacred word ego on it. Of course, ego identifying the notion of the self. And for Ayn Rand, what she sees is society constantly chipping away at the individualism that's so important if one is to have any sense of freedom at all. Well, that's the novel. Let's now work through our understanding. Now, we call it in 303 the Big Five, as we've often referred to it. What does this novel say about? And then we got Big Five: epistemology, ontology, psychology, sociology, theodicy. Let's go through each of them, and obviously we'll define them as we go one more time. Epistemology, what do we mean? Well, we mean this study of knowledge. What can you know, right? And this is huge in this novel. All his life, he thinks that what it is that he is living is all that he can know. And then he discovers things, and in the process of discovery, he moves from a certain absolutist kind of cultural view, societal view, to rather well, what we will call it, a fallibilist view, right? That is to say, when positions are challenged, and I have to go, you know, I think I'm right, but I could be wrong. That I could be wrong is something no one in his society is willing to accept. Of course, it's foundational for Ayn Rand. It's foundational, epistemologically, to believe, if you're going to do any science, in the fallibilist position, okay? Now, I think that there's always been a tension in interpreting Ayn Rand, her life and her work, because she was such an absolutist in her thinking. But it's clear from her novels that the fallibilist position is in fact a legitimate Randian position. The way one gets to any kind of epistemological certainty is through rational thought and investigation. And obviously our narrator here, our hero of the novel, is attempting to do that very thing. What does the novel say about ontology and what we can understand about who we are, our being? And this is, of course, the individual versus the group. That is to say, which one of the two is more important? Now, John Stuart Mill, in his classic essay on liberty, will ask this question and will come to the same position that Ayn Rand will come to in many ways, and that is the individual has to be more important than the society. Now, we'll talk a little bit later about a more integral perspective that says, I'm sorry, why does it have to be one or the other? I mean, this dualism is sort of going to get us into a lot of philosophic problems. And yet for Rand, I think this is a question that has to be addressed. Who are you? And for Ayn Rand, it's hypercritical that you accept that you are an individual with the capacity to think and reason and therefore to experience freedom if you're willing to use your reason. What does this novel tell us about psychology, the individual mind, the importance of self-identity? We think about Ralph Waldo Emerson's classic Self-Reliance, an essay that you'll study as high school students later with us. You can look at learnstrong.net and see our lectures on self-reliance. He who would be a man must be a nonconformist, and certainly Ayn Rand is playing around with the same notion. That is to say, we become, in many ways, psychologically, the stories we tell, the stories we retell, the stories we accept or the stories we reject. And in our novel here, in our poem, we'll have, in fact, a narrator who rejects a certain kind of view, right? A collectivist view. What does this novel say about sociology? Now, I think this is one of the contributions that often Rand is not given proper appreciation for. She says that when we begin to think in these kind of collective mindsets, the peer pressure, if you will, that we can become intellectually, spiritually deformed in some way. That is to say, you begin to doubt your own ability to think for yourself, and you have to look up and hear what somebody else has to say before you can make up your own mind. It is Orwell's Big Brother from 1984, and Ayn Rand has some serious reservations about what it means to live in and through that kind of an experience. She, of course, lived it in many ways, watching what happened to her father in Russia itself, and she had a very fierce, then, strong sense of the importance of individualism, which, of course, economically is often tied to views of capitalism, especially because of her novel Atlas Shrugged, which we'll have more to say about on learnstrong.net. Finally, what does this text say about theodicy, the idea that there is evil in this world, and what's the point of, if there is any point, in the suffering in the world? The value of suffering for Ayn Rand, and this is one of her foundational arguments on all of her work, is when bad things happen, you can't ask why did it happen to me. You have to learn to ask why did it happen for me. Suffering and pain is propedeutic if one's able to use one's reason and to not perpetuate that same pain and suffering. I mean, our narrator can't believe that in a culture that has only candles and he brings electricity and therefore light and a light bulb, why in heaven's name they would have any problem with that at all. That is to say, freedom is only going to happen when one is able to use one's reason. And often collectively, there can be tremendous suffering that is imposed. Again, we think about some of the terrible kinds of things that happened in the 20th century, now into the 21st century, where large numbers of people come together to enforce a certain ideology which creates a lot of pain and suffering, especially to those individuals who will stand up and say, I don't agree with that at all. I see some of you smiling because it's very much like what happens, of course, at Worland High School or any high school for that matter. Stand up and say you don't agree with what most people are espousing, and right away you're going to probably be labeled in some way as being somehow fundamentally dangerous, right? Go back and take a look at our comments on Emily Dickinson. Much madness is divinest sense to the discerning eye, and you'll see what we're talking about there. You're straightway dangerous and handled with a chain if you step up and say against to the majority, if the minority or someone in the minority says, I don't agree at all with what you just said. Well, let's address the different levels of reading here at level 2A, themes and messages. Well, obviously, the dangers of the collective is one of the central ideas in this book. The power of the individual is the other. The heroic power of the individual in the quest for freedom, right? And to some degree, some have always called Ayn Rand guilty of hero worship for this reason. But I think it's a certain kind of idea that she is worshiping, if she's worshiping anything. It's the idea of the quest for freedom through the individual reason in the mind. She doesn't preclude the notion that other individuals can come together, but it has to be voluntary of their own choosing, right? Of course, another theme message here is the critique of the utopian society, that dystopian notion that when you are forced to have to live in a collective by some kind of power authority figure, usually that's going to turn sideways really badly for the individual and therefore for the advancement of society and civilization. At 2B, the rhetorical level, what are we looking at in terms of symbolism? Well, the word I obviously is a powerful symbol because it's not in the book. Students have often said it drives them nuts to read this book because they want the I to be there and it's the we all the time, or the us or the they. The ego, the individual, is obviously then represented, powerfully symbolized, represented powerfully by that light bulb. And we think about a philosopher that we'll learn later named Descartes, who came up with that really famous notion of I think, therefore I am. That idea of the individual ego, the individual consciousness, is a powerful understanding of what makes us who we are. The irony, of course, of this text is that the group can't accept the new discovery by our narrator, right? Even though it's going to help in some fundamental ways, can't do it, right? Drives them nuts, especially to think that some street sweeper is the one that invented the concept or came by the concept that elitism is something Ayn Rand loathed as well. She had to deal with it all of her biography, all of her life, as she came to America as a foreign, as a Russian, and of course as a woman as well. She had a lot to say about that. At 3A, how we relate this to other texts? Well, we've mentioned a whole bunch of titles. Obviously, novels that are dystopian in their nature. The Giver comes to mind, Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-Five and Cat's Cradle, and a whole number of other kinds of texts that come to mind. I've already mentioned Plato's Republic. I think it's hypercritical. If you're really going to read the work of Ayn Rand, you got to read Plato, and you got to know what it is that she's working with. And Plato's Republic, again, learnstrong.net is a place to go here. It is true that Plato will celebrate in a hero worship kind of way Socrates, especially in the Platonic dialogue Apology. So I would go and take a look at that, where Socrates is accorded to have said the unexamined life is not worth living, a notion that, of course, all of the Randian heroes are going to play out. Here, as I mentioned in Randian Heroes, here is the birth, in many ways, kind of the genesis of Rand's formulations, philosophic formulations. For Fountainhead, Atlas Shrugged, here is the birth in this novel of our great Randian heroes. Howard Rourke, Reardon, and Galt are all born in many ways in the moment of this novel. We have other hero myths. I mean, it's, of course, self-evident. He calls himself Prometheus, that bringer of not just light. Go back to your study with Edith Hamilton's mythology about what it is that Prometheus brings to the humans. It isn't just light. It is intellectual light. It's the study of the sciences, etc., right? We think, of course, about other heroes that are created in mythology. We think about Homer, we think about Virgil, and Dante and Milton, all creating these amazing heroes. And we ask about how they will work as well with Ayn Rand's Anthem. Think about the American individualistic spirit. Our study of Emerson, Thoreau, and Whitman will play this game. Thoreau, for example, in his Civil Disobedience is going to be so powerful. I've already mentioned Emerson's Self-Reliance and all the other essays I lecture on learnstrong.net, as well as Walt Whitman and the power of the idea of I sing about myself, and that notion from Song of Myself, that celebrating myself, you can celebrate yourself in the same way. We also think in the American tradition of the great Martin Luther King Jr., as well as Malcolm X, as well as all of the other important heroes of our culture. Rosa Parks comes to mind. All of these will in some ways be easily relatable for us with our reading of Anthem. Finally, these questions to relate to yourself at 3B. What about this novel is it that you love best? And what is it that you hate the most, you really don't like. It's interesting to me, of all the writers that we read in 303, Ayn Rand seems to elicit a powerful response one way or the other very regularly. And I love that about her work. I challenge you to think about some more questions. For example, why is it so hard to be a nonconformist? Emerson will say in Self-Reliance that the world whips you for it. Why is that such a difficult thing to go against what others believe? In any number of directions, why is that so difficult? How about this one? Must it be an either-or proposition, the individual versus the collective, for example? So, the accusation here is that Rand is just another absolutist thinker in the end. For example, biographers had pointed out how much she loathed Immanuel Kant as a philosopher. But it brings back this question. You pick up a coin, it has two sides, same coin. This notion of the individual versus the collective versus the group, and the tension between the two, isn't there a way to somehow balance that view? We've often spoken in 303 about what we call the integral type of philosophy. This philosophy made popular by theorists like Ken Wilber, for example, that we've spoken of before, will argue, if you'll think about it, there is, and if you want, you can again make that what we call the four quadrants. You can create that X on your paper. And at the top, on the top right, you can put, there's stuff that's outside, and then on the top left, there's stuff that's inside. Down the left-hand side, you can say there's stuff that's singular, and there's stuff that's plural. And about you, would say there's at least four of you. There is your top right, your body. You grow physically, you grow up. But that's not the only up, is there? On the top left, there's the mind, your consciousness, the way you wake up, not just grow up, and the ways in which you come to certain kinds of moral and ethical understandings. We've commented before that you move from an egocentric, that is to say everything is just about me and nobody else, to an ethnocentric, everything is about the collective I belong to. But there is a movement beyond those two to a world-centric view that begins to try to take into consideration as many other understandings as possible. In the lower left, that inside plural, well, that's cultural. And to that degree, to some degree, collective. That notion, for example, of language and the adoption of language is a prime example. Notice at the end of the novel, it's a bit ironic. Growing up all his life in a collective, what's the first thing that he does once he finally gets free of the collective? He wants to go back and start a new collective. Interesting, right? He's going to go back, he's going to find individuals who share his view of freedom and the power of the individual, and together they're going to remake the world a better way. That is to say, there's a certain kind of cultural rendering. Finally, in the lower outside right, there is an outside pluralistic, this is systems theory to some degree. This is the idea of, again, the communal, the need of the communal in some way. There has to be, what's our Platonic term? There has to be a balance. There has to be a harmony. If there isn't, it's either a misunderstanding or it's a proper reading of Rand and she got it wrong. There certainly needs to be an understanding. I think it's a misunderstanding of Rand's work. I think Rand was sophisticated enough of a thinker to realize there has to be a balance between the two. You can't have society without individuals. You can't have individuals without society. As we have often said, two people hooked up and exchange fluids to produce you. And in some really important way, your life has never been your life. It's always been our life. We're all in this together. That is to say, you got to have language you learn from somebody else in the first 2 years of your life. Nothing you choose. It's all given to you, provided for you. But here's the beauty of stories. As we said, we are the stories we tell, the stories we retell. But we're also the stories we accept and reject. Notice in our story, the rejection of a story is the beginning of a new quest, right? Well, what are you going to do with your reading of Anthem? I leave it with you. And what about the world that your great-great-grandchildren will someday live in? Don't say that you won't have any children. They're all your children. They're all our children, right? But long after we're dead, you ain't met no 200-year-old people, right? Which means you only get to swing at the park for a little bit, then you got to go to the van. Long, long after the fact, what's a park going to look like? That's a fair question to ask, I think. And I think Ayn Rand's Anthem challenges us to ask that question. Now, with that in mind, we can pick up other of the Ayn Rand novels. Let's go ahead and turn later in our career to Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged, and we'll ask some questions about this ongoing debate. I think it's a good debate. I think it's worthy of our time. I think we have to be informed before we make our decisions. I hope that you'll enjoy your reading and study of more Ayn Rand's work. Thank you.